you can't take these things as in such a simplistic way. And I think, put into the conversations of very young kids, really quite complicated and very sensitive issues. You've got to be very careful about this. And from what I've read, the few extracts I've read of this book, it seems to me to be maybe more an exercise in publicity than education.
A story which is in the Times today. Fascinated to get your thoughts on this. It's about a new children's book about Princess Diana. It's going to be published next week, and it's going to include a part where it talks about her bulimia. It's the latest instalment of the Little People, Big Dreams series. It basically teaches young children from about 5 plus, to learn about historical figures. Now, for people who haven't read this in the Times this morning, let me just read you the section about it. It says, even though her life seemed to be taken from the pages of a fairy tale, she soon realised that the prince's heart belonged to someone else. Over time, that sadness grew into an eating disorder called bulimia. Whenever she felt alone, she sought relief by eating all the cakes she could find in the royal kitchen. But that sweet feeling of comfort didn't last long. Once it was gone, she would try to rid herself of all of the food by making herself sick. It then went on saying it took her time to seek help, learn to love herself and stop hurting her body. But once she did, she felt better than ever. She was one of the first famous people to speak up about her struggles with bulimia, helping others to confront it too. Jack, how do you feel about that being in a book that is read by really quite small children?
I'm very uncomfortable with this, I have to say. This is a really serious issue, and I absolutely believe in chatting to kids about these kind of issues at the right age and in the right way. But I feel very uncomfortable at this. It does feel a bit exploitative. The late Princess Diana, has grandchildren. Those grandchildren are at an age where they could be picking up this book in a shop if they're taken to a bookshop by the mum and dad to go and, I know however unlikely that might be, but I'm sure it happens, to go and pick a book. I feel very uncomfortable about it. It feels a little bit too raw. This is a story that could be written without names, and be effective, possibly more effective.
That's interesting. So you have the issue.
I feel very, very uncomfortable about it.
So, Jack, do you have the issue with it being Princess Diana's name being on it, or the description of what bulimia is?
Well, I think both. I think it reads. I mean, I haven't read the whole book, so it's wrong to make a 100% comment on this. But the extracts that I read when I knew that you were going to raise this morning looked to me like they were more lecturing about the topic than raising and perhaps provoking a conversation with mum or dad about the topic. I think the association with the name of somebody who's still very recent and whose family are still around and whose grandkids are around, it just felt to me as if it was an attempt to sell the book rather than actually raise the issue in a gentle but educational way.
Anita, where do you stand on this?
So I'm also not entirely comfortable, probably for slightly different reasons. I think the first is just the thing about the age, right? These books, I've heard of them, they're normally geared at quite young children and tend to tell these sort of inspirational stories about interesting historical figures. So that feels about right, but sort of 5 feels a little young for bulimia. So that's sort of point number one. Point number two, I'm not sure I'm keen on the kind of characterization of bulimia as a response to the fact that you're not loved by your husband or whoever. It feels these things are incredibly complicated. I'm by no means an expert on eating disorders or the like, but it feels like a sort of, I understand the need to kind of make it accessible or to move to a sort of, why was she sad? Her husband didn't love her. She turned to bulimia. It just feels very simplistic. And I think that the broader idea that, you can have everything you want, but if you're not loved, then the whole world is incredibly difficult. I'm not sure that message completely resonates, and maybe you could argue that was her experience, but I think anyone that has sort of done any reading about what happened or has followed the story, knows there was a combination of her being very young, kind of in the public eye. There were lots of other facets here that I think challenged her mental health. And I just think that thing about, it's all about the fact that he didn't love her, that just doesn't quite sit right with me as a message, particularly for young girls.
But I guess the problem is, Anita, you can't explain that to a 5-year-old. Kids are very simplistic. I remember reading Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls to my daughters, which takes really important historical figures and just explains things simply. And there's a transgender girl, Corey Mathis, I think is the name, in the book, and it talks about how she wasn't allowed to go to school and use the girls' toilets, and my kids were like, well, why couldn't she just use the toilet? And kids are very simplistic. You can't really get into all of the different layers of what bulimia is, but if you're maybe just exposing kids to this so they're aware of it, they just kind of go, oh, right, okay, yeah, and move on, because that's what kids do when they're little.
You also get, I overheard a conversation yesterday between two kids about one of them wants to join the army cadets at school. The other one's really upset because he thinks he might die. He's joining the army. You can't take these things in such a simplistic way. And I think, put into the conversations of very young kids, really quite complicated and very sensitive issues. You've got to be very careful about this. And from what I've read, the few extracts I've read of this book, it seems to me to be maybe more an exercise in publicity than education.